guys, now I don't know if anyone else is absolutely baking today, but here in England it is way too hot. Now we are currently experiencing a heat wave and I was not prepared for it, and this week I am off work. I don't really have any commitments as such. So today I was planning to go out and do a bit of an adventure. I left the house for about 4 minutes and melted about 7 times. So I thought I'd just come inside and make something. Now next to me I have the biggest bag of fabrics you'd ever seen. And when I left school I was basically given loads of old dressing up clothes that the children didn't wear anymore and that they had no use for. So I thought I'll make something out of these, and so I decided to make a new friend for my bed, which is this little bat cushion. Now I am no way that experienced at sewing. I've only used the sewing machine twice in my life before this. One was at school, the second was to make this pillow cover here, which is from the Little Shop of Horrors, and thought the next progression from a simple square would be a bat. So this is made out of some dressing up clothes. So what I thought I'd do is I just film the whole process of how I made this and just talk over it and show you how you do it. It's really simple. All you need is some black fabric. So I was using a black Halloween outfit, which was for the children, and you also need I used a sewing machine, but you could do it by hand. It would just take a lot longer. Some cardboard, which is slightly optional, scissors, thread, a needle, and also some stuffing. So I got some like regular toy stuffing from Hobbycraft, and that just worked really nicely in this. Now in hindsight I probably would have used a different fabric to the one I used, because this one is very silky and soft, which is fantastic, but it means that it does kind of ladder and pull quite easily. So as you'll probably see from the next few clips, there was a lot of backwards and forwarding with making this. But I did get there in the end, and I'm quite pleased with this little guy. I was completely inspired to do this by one of my very dear friends that I have met through YouTube, who I've been talking to for seems like ever now, and they made me the cutest little things for my bed. You've probably seen them cropping up around, but she made me this really cute little cat bat, and it just really inspired me to like make something that wasn't just a square. So I am going to start trying to do some crochet, but I thought I'd try with a little bit of a simpler method first. So this is just a really quick tutorial as to how to make, well, I don't know if you call this a bat cushion, but I intended it to be a cushion, but it's kind of a little bit like a weird plush toy. So let's get on with that. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope that my voiceover is in time. So I started off with this cardboard box and just opened it out so it was nice and flat. I then went and grabbed myself a biro so that I could draw myself my bat outline. Now I was only intending to draw half of this bat, so I'm not really sure why I drew the whole body, but I just made sure that its wings were pretty simple, not too technical in shape. Then I folded it in half and just cut out one of the sides, so when you open it up it gives you a nice symmetrical bat. I did make it slightly bigger than my original drawing. I then grabbed the material and I'm using these 2 Halloween outfits. So I then straightened out my black fabric and put my cardboard bat in the right place and began to pin it down. Now this was so hard because the material's really silky and it moved around loads, but also the cardboard was really thick. So this is why it's kind of like an optional step. You could just draw it straight onto the material. So now I'm taking my fabric scissors and I'm just kind of cutting off some of the excess fabric just to make it a little bit easier. And then I'm cutting around the cardboard shape, which is the whole reason why I made this cardboard shape, because I wanted it to be somewhat symmetrical. I found this quite difficult just again because the material was so slidey. So hindsight I would have used a thicker cotton, but you live and learn. So at this point I was nicely taking out my pins when I was interrupted by the postman. Look at all this lovely post I got, and I just had to open this up because it was my new Spiral Direct bear, which I was really excited about. So he became the mascot for this video while I removed the rest of the pins. So now that the cardboard is removed, I'm left with just my black cutout of a bat, and I needed a second one because otherwise it would just be a piece of fabric. And so I just again cut round the fabric and I pinned this already cut out bat onto another piece of fabric so I could cut out another bat. And I took the same fabric scissors and cut round. Now this is again where a thicker, sturdier fabric would have done better because it did slide and slip around a lot. Didn't matter how many pins I had in, it didn't quite match up. but it didn't really matter too much because I will be sewing slightly in from the outside lines anyway. I then took all the pins out so that it was ready to decorate. So again, this is an optional step. I decided to give his body a little bit of a decoration, so I found this really nice starry net material and I just cut it to the shape of his body. Once I was happy with the shape, I just got some pins and I pinned it down because I was going to be sewing this to this piece of material. Now this will be the front of my cushion, so the back of my cushion is put to the side. So now it's time to blow the dust off my sewing machine and start sewing. I did do a little test run there on another piece of fabric and it was then ready to actually sew the real thing. So it was quite hard to sew the outline of this just because of the difference in materials, but I sewed slightly in from the outside of the net, so I was able to cut it down precisely once I had finished sewing. So once it was finished, I just kind of made sure that it was all attached. There was a little bit that wasn't quite attached properly, and then I cut off all the loose threads and some of the excess net that was there, and I just sort of made it a little bit more neat. And then I started to think about what else I could do to this bat to give him a little bit more detail. So we can't have a vampire bat without any fangs, so I ran upstairs and got an old cowboy outfit and cut out some of the white bits to make these fangs. Now hindsight, these were a tiny bit big, but you know, you live and learn. I thought that these were the right size when I was measuring them up, so it gives him quite a sort of cartoony, sort of cute look, which is never a bad thing. And I did try and pin these fangs down to sort of get them in position because I kept changing my mind where I wanted them to go, but in the end I just ended up sewing them on because it was just getting too frustrating and they were too smaller pieces of fabric, and also they started to fray as well, which is another reason why I had to quickly sew them on. But this only took a few seconds and then I needed to cut off all the excess string again. Now on my giveaway, one of my lovely subscribers actually mentioned that bats aren't actually blind. Well, some bats aren't blind, so I decided to add it some eyes. Now as you can see, I went way too big with the eyes and then I went way too small, so it took me a couple of attempts to get them the right size. I was planning to actually sew these eyes on with the machine, but I did end up actually creating these eyes and sewing the pupil in and then actually doing the rest by hand, just because again the material started to fray, and as you can see it's a right kerfuffle trying to actually sew in a circle when it is that tiny a piece of fabric. But I did actually manage to try and sew this onto here, but as you can see it all just messes up and it starts creasing the fabric, and I just decided to stop while I was ahead. So I just ended up sewing the pupil onto the other red eye, and then I went back to actually the cushion and left these on the side to use later. So I went and found that other piece of fabric that I cut out in the bat shape and laid it out on top of the one I had just made, because you want all the detail to be on the inside, because you do actually end up turning it inside out once it's sewed. So I used 101 pins just to secure this down and try and line it up where I could, but obviously it didn't all match. Now once I'd used a sufficient amount of pins and I was ready to go, I then put it under the sewing machine foot and off we went. So it was slightly harder to sew than I expected it to be. As I said, I have recently only been sewing squares, so all of this kind of different jagged movement was slightly annoying, but I did actually get the sort of grips of it in the end. As you can see, the material really didn't match up too well. Now, I'm not sure if this is where I cut it wrong or I had pinned it wrong, but it did kind of mess up a little bit, so I had a few troubles on the way. Another thing is that I kept getting the pins caught in it because, like an absolute idiot, I left the pins slightly too close to the edges, so then I ended up running over the pins. So I had a little bit of an issue with that, but as you can see I just tried to keep going around. And something that's really important when you're doing is to actually leave a tiny little section unsewed. So you need to leave somewhat a hole in it so that you can turn it inside out. Now I did actually end up going over little parts of my sewing, just where I had taken the foot off, or it had caught on a pin, or for some reason it just hadn't sewn very well. So I did end up going through little sections and actually just redoing them. And once I was happy, I took out all the pins, cut off all the loose threads, and then it was time to turn it inside out. So using the little hole that was left, I just squished all the rest of the material back through on itself so that it was in fact inside out. And as you can see, it sort of began to kind of take shape as a bat. It was still quite blobby, so I did use a pen, and if you use the end of the pen you can slowly push out some of the more finer details, such as the points of the wings and the ears and the bottom of the body, which kind of end up too sort of circular and bulbous unless you push them out and define them with the end of a sharpish or sort of pointed object. And once I was happy with the shape, I then got some toy stuffing, which I actually bought from Hobbycraft, and I shoved bits of it in. I ended up doing one wing first and making sure it got right down into the points of the wing, and then I did the other wing, and then I slowly worked on the body, and then lastly I did its head. It did kind of look a bit odd at first because I had all the stuffing at the bottom, but as soon as I started filling out the ears, it kind of got more like a bat shape to it, and I was pretty happy with it. I tried to put a little bit more around its tummy so it looked like a little bit of a fat squishy bat, but also it makes it a little bit more softer and squishier as a cushion. I then kind of molded it around, and once I was fully happy with it, it was then time to sew it shut. So I grabbed some white cotton because I was going to use this for detailing later, and I actually hand sewed this little bit shut. So this is the tiny little hole that was left so that you could turn the whole thing inside out. Now you could do this on the machine if you wanted to, but personally, just because of the shape and where I'd left the hole, hand sewing it was a lot easier. I've done so much hand sewing in the past. I pretty much use hand sewing for everything, so I'm a lot quicker at it than using a machine anyway. And once I was happy, I just squished it around and made sure it looked like a bat. So now it's time to go back to these lovely eyes that I had made earlier on, and I began to hand sew these. Now I wanted to just do a fine little hand stitch around the outside of the eye, which I did start to do, and then it began to fray like crazy. So I ended up having to sew through the actual pupil in the middle, and it ended up getting this kind of, I actually quite like the effect, sort of a fanny effect around the outside, because actually just sewing through the red material was too thin, so sewing through the black and the red was the only real option, and I really liked the effect, so I did it on the other eye as well and just made sure that it was all nice and secure. Now because it did fray, there was loads of like random bits of red material sticking out from every other direction, so I then actually had to get scissors once I'd finished sewing it and cut off some of the little bits of excess red fluff. So once they were attached, I then looked at him and thought, you are not finished, you need some more details. So I went in with a needle and some white thread and just did a little bit of simple detailing within him. I added a few details to his ears and also gave him a little bit more of a defined mouth, and then I do later on go on to putting some detail within the wings. Now the reason I did this kind of like an in and out stitch, it was quite rough, is almost like the kind of stitch that you do before you actually use a sewing machine and then take it out, like a tacking stitch. I just decided to do it like this because I kind of had already given him quite a cartoony look, and I thought I'd go along with this kind of aesthetic and make him almost look a little bit ragdollish. So I did actually decide to do his wings in an almost kind of realistic way, but with this same kind of ragdoll stitch, and give it this kind of cartoony, sort of soft toy look. Now obviously this bit is completely optional. I only did it just because my material looked almost a little bit too plain, because I had the starry bit in the middle and I wanted to break it up a little bit, and because these stars are white, I felt like a black and white theme would go quite nicely. I did also sew around the outside of the tummy because it did end up like cinching it in slightly either side, which then gave him a bit of a fatter stomach, and it kind of gave it a little bit more of this kind of bat shape that I was actually originally looking for. I then tried to actually just like replicate exactly what I'd done on the other side on the second side, and what I do when I do this stitching is I actually tie a little knot in the end of the cotton, and then I pull it through from some obscure other place in the actual whole cushion, and then it ends up getting caught up in the netting inside, and it does really secure it nice and well. Now these stitches are prone to coming out if you have anything like my kitten, because if he nibbles on any of these stitches, that's the end of it, they all come out. But once you've done that, that's the bat finished, and of course you can add more detail or less detail, but that is just my finished product. So there you have it, there's how you make one of these cute little bats. Of course, it's so up to your own imagination. You can make it a completely different colour. You don't need to even add these details if you don't want to. You could change the bit at the front. It's all just personal opinion, and I was using what materials I had. A tip I would have is to use a slightly thicker, maybe more like a cotton material, rather than like a really thin, like synthetic silk material. But at the same time, it does mean that he is now super smooth. So there are pros and cons to everything. If you guys enjoy these kind of videos, I am constantly doing little craft projects all the time, and if you are interested in seeing any more of the little things that I make, then please do leave them down in the comments. And also, if you've got any like requests for things for me to make, I would love to like take up those projects. I hope that you're having a lovely week and you're not melting too much. If it's sunny where you are, I hope you're enjoying the shade, and I will see you next time. Bye!